I will call the Executive Body Board to order for Tuesday, January 31st, 2023. Due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, in accordance with Chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, public bodies otherwise governed by the open meeting law are temporarily relieved from the requirement that meetings be held in public places, open and physically accessible to the public, so long as measures are taken to ensure public access to the body's deliberations through adequate and alternative means. This meeting will be live on Zoom. The public may participate remotely by joining Zoom meeting ID number 854-0032-4335 or by calling 929-205-6099. For additional information about remote participation, please contact Carly Antonellis, Assistant Town Manager at ATM at Ayer.MA.US or 978-772-8220 extension 100 prior to the meeting. All right. So welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join today. First item we have on the agenda is approval of the meeting minutes from November 15th, 2022. I had no issues or changes.
None.
Okay. Do I have a motion for approval, please?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from November 15th, 2022.
I'll second.
Okay. Roll call the vote. Ms. Antonellis?
Aye.
Ms. Tierney?
Aye.
Mr. Brazakowski?
Perfect. Aye.
Mr. Pompeo?
Aye.
Thank you. Moving on, we have an update on the 2024 budget.
Mr. Chair, good
Yes,
afternoon. Just real quick on the FY24 budget update. As everybody knows, we had the first forum last week. Thank you, everybody on here, for your support and input on that. As we saw, and we'll move forward, I'm going to have under my report to the select board on Tuesday's meeting. One of the things is the energy costs, energy fuel costs driving this. And since the last forum, Chuck Schultz, our facilities director, has made some significant progress, at least on the electric front. So I hope to have an update on that by Tuesday. In addition to the energy and fuel, the other point on there is a proposal for a administrative sergeant, which Chief Gill did make a brief presentation on as part of the forum, and we posted that to the budget page. And there is also a proposal to make the assistant building inspector code enforcement officer full-time. So those were sort of the two personnel increases that have about $130,000 impact to the budget, just over $300,000 on the energy driver there as well. Also, as discussed, and pretty much everybody is familiar with this, there are placeholders on all of the insurances, including health insurance, at 15% in the budget. We're cautiously optimistic and hoping that'll come down to at least 10%, if not less, but realistically 10%. The Minuteman Neshoba Health Group has a meeting on February 6th, where Amanda Lewis should have some more information on the insurance rates. So in that draft one budget, all of the insurance numbers have contingency estimates that we're hopeful are on a little bit on the high side. So there's progress hopefully there. Lastly, this Friday, February 3rd, the Neshoba Valley Technical High School will be releasing its budget and assessment information. Once we receive that, I will transmit that to the select board and the FinCom electronically, and we will post that to the budget page. Dr. Pigeon, the superintendent, has indicated to me that if the select board and or FinCom would like them to come to Ayer, they generally haven't in the past, but they're more than happy to come to talk about the assessment. I'm told there is going to be somewhat of an increase based on increased number of students from Ayer to there. Also, on Tuesday, February 7th, the Ayer Shirley Regional School District, Dr. Renda will be coming. That'll be a joint meeting of the FinCom and the Select Board to present the FY24 school budget. So that's sort of a snapshot as we move through the process, at least on the operating side. Through the chair, Barbara, did you have anything from your end that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'm looking at my list and I think you basically covered everything. We're just waiting on those numbers that'll come in the next few weeks. And the only other thing I'm looking to do is connect with the assessor. I was hoping today and it didn't work out, just to verify some estimated growth numbers, but I should have that soon as well.
So I do have one question. I noticed this at the presentation. In the retirement of debt, there's a reclassification of GL numbers for $250,000 that's driving the large increase.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we have a negative 250 somewhere else within the budget?
So what happened was last year, they actually got rid of dividing up the principal versus the interest payment of debt. So we put it back in the two separate lines. So I'm being cautiously, projecting the debt based on the last, what I'm going to be borrowing for in the spring. So I don't have those final numbers yet. They might be a little high, but it didn't transfer from somewhere else. It was listed as 0 last year in the interest column. And then this year we separated them back out.
Okay.
And,
So
and keep in mind the
260
debt projections include the pumper and
Okay.
all of last fiscal year. So we're having our debt, it was going to come back up a little bit.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Anything else on the budget? Any other questions or comments?
That was pretty much everything I had.
Okay. Excellent. Next item is discussion on recommendation for increasing the debt exclusion threshold in the capital planning policy.
So, Mr. Chair and members of the BI board, I apologize. Some of you know this, some of you don't, that the town's network server crashed over the weekend.
Okay.
And as a result of that, we have been unable to access any of our files. Everything is going to be fine and that it's going to be backed up and we should be back booted by Thursday is the timeline on that. So the presentation, I had a couple slides to facilitate this discussion. I can't access from, but I can get those to folks. But the first point, what we've been discussing, at least conceptually, was in the town's capital planning policy, which is part of the town's financial policies, which were last updated in 2019 as we're doing that review, which is the next item. The issue came up, it's come up through the capital planning committee discussions, as the chair knows. It's also come up internally, is the issue of the threshold that triggers in the policy a debt exclusion. So historically, that had been at 250,000. Then it had been revised to 300,000, and the actual policy has it at 300,000, the 2019 policy. But if others will recall, it was updated before the pandemic to 350,000 was the threshold. The discussion that has come up is, do we revisit that threshold and do we increase that threshold? Why would we increase it? One is potentially to take into account increased costs, inflation, and so forth. And obviously, when a debt exclusion is activated, it's the two-part process of town meeting vote and a ballot vote. So we had looked at, and I'll, through the chair, have Barbara speak to this. We had looked at other towns and checked also with the DOR on a debt exclusion threshold, a debt exclusion policy. And a lot of municipalities, and we're not advocating this for today, don't actually have a dollar threshold. It has to do with the capacity within to borrow and the debt schedule. It's very general. I'm not advocating, I don't think any of us are advocating that, because I think there's value to the specificity of the parameters like we have in the air policy. So it was just interesting as we looked at a lot of towns, it had a capital planning policy, but not a specific cap. So then through the chair, I'll have Barbara speak to, did some calculations and analysis looking at the 300,000 and looking in today's rates. Barbara, why don't you can.
Yeah, so again, I don't have access to what I had planned to have printed for today, but
Understood.
the general information is that the buying power from 10 years ago, setting out, say 350,000 is the equivalent of well over 500,000 today. And when I was looking at the different CPI calculators and indexes, they were using an average inflation. And if you look at what the type of things we're specifically purchasing, supplies, services, the inflation rates were even higher. So that's in a nutshell what I had. I just had some data backup that I was going to show you.
All right, thanks. I do think it's worth maybe revisiting this at a future meeting once everything's up and running and you have access to the files.
Yeah.
Yeah, we apologize on.
No, that's
on
okay.
But
Yeah.
I mean, basically, based on my research, 350,000 is low. If we were going to set a threshold, I feel it's low.
Yeah, I agree. It feels like, especially now with inflation, the way it has been and the way that the town is growing and the amount of projects that we're seeing, it feels like, this year, so like we have 2 capital exclusions so far on the agenda for this year. And, I think, if it remains low, we're going to run into years where we're going to have possibly 3 or 4, which creates a very difficult challenge. I definitely don't want to go towards the way of other towns and just kind of leave it open. I do like having that set definition of a dollar amount because it gives town meeting the ability to say yes or no automatically. And then the ballot box is the secondary.
Yes, so Mr. Chair, perhaps again, without the materials for today due to the technical.
No, it's okay.
I don't know if you want to hold off, on that. What Barbara's analysis and the information we have is looking at a potential recommendation of changing it to 500,000. You don't have to do that. I mean, this is just an advisory body anyhow. So there's that piece. And then the other 2 issues with the capital planning policy that we've been discussing conceptually, and of course I had a slide for this. One, which the chair we've encountered through capital planning, especially this year, but in previous years, is some language in the policy for these large projects that are coming before, capital planning. Folks fill out the forms and what have you and submit them. But what we're finding, especially in this climate since the pandemic and so forth, is that there needs to be a higher level of specificity on the numbers when they get to the capital planning committee. For example, and I'll use it if the chair doesn't mind, the playground project, for example, and now it's turned into this sort of 2-part funding. What we want to do in the policy, and I'll get this, for the next meeting and get this to folks, I had some proposed language that would change the capital planning policy and puts it on the departments in submitting the request. Number one, at a certain threshold. So I use 350,000 because that's what the current any project of 350,000 and above, when it is submitted, there needs to be a bona fide, cost estimate. it should consider or factor in contingencies, because that's another thing we've learned. Some folks will put in a contingency, some folks won't. And that was another criteria. And also, I think we need to, and the chair has brought this up previously, and it is in the policy, but re-emphasize it, get into also some level of projections on operating costs for some of these larger projects where applicable. In other words, in the policy, like this is more like for a building or so,
Right, yeah.
it's in there. So not to belabor the point, but that was the second item, was that we would have some language, which we'll get to folks, and some further criteria to develop a level of accuracy and specificity on these numbers from the beginning of the process. Now, everybody knows there are unknown variables that happen in any process on increases, but we've had some, projects that have real big guesstimate numbers, and we want to refine that further. The third thing, so we had three things. One was the debt exclusion threshold. One was the mechanics in the policy for more information and specificity up front on the large projects. The third one is the issue of right now, and I looked at this, right now, the capital is defined in the policy as any one-time purchase of $10,000 or more with at least a 5-year, generally a 5-year life cycle to it. And interestingly, the question came up, do we need to look at potentially increasing that? That's been at 10,000 since before my time. In researching this, and again, I would have had a slide for this, most of what we have found, folks just either have the 10,000, and in fairness, some of those policies, if you look at the date, haven't been updated, as either 10,000 or 20,000. There wasn't, a larger threshold there. So again, for the purposes of discussion in the review, that's another potential consideration. I know that the intent is obviously these one-time capital that meet this should be going through the capital vetting process. However, factoring in for costs and so forth, again, perhaps a small, increase on that front would be warranted. But what we have found is right now is 15 to 20,000.
Okay. Yeah,
So-
I think one interesting aspect, just thinking through the way that the budget is compiled, is that by that definition, then the cruiser that the police department buy every year should technically go through capital. So perhaps we also want to add some exclusions to that, where it's been embedded in their operating budget because it's an annual purchase. So therefore, something along some verbiage around, certain exclusions to that requirement of having to go through the full capital process.
Good point. So we could, aren't computers great until they fail?
Absolutely.
Because we had all of this data for the shared screens, but the network down. So that's another good point. So that's where, again, we had hoped to have that information. Those were the three major areas that were remaining on the capital. One was the question of whether or not to increase the debt exclusion threshold. The second was, do we put language, and there's a language proposal to require departments on larger projects of over 350,000. And I just picked that as to provide more front work on the numbers and so forth. The third was what constitutes a capital item in terms of the threshold. It's 10,000 right now. That's information we have found. 15 to 20 seems to be on the high end. And then, Scott, your point that you just made, we can take a look at as far as some potential exemptions, like there is that police cruiser replacement schedule. And there may be some other exemptions. So that's where we had planned for today's discussion on the capital planning policy.
Yeah, I definitely think it's worth having the discussion again with the slides. I know it would be a little repetitive, but just for, the sake
Mhm.
of, getting the recording of what the information we have actually on the slides, I think would be beneficial to the public.
One last question. Now, just thinking of this.
Sure.
And Barbara and I had mentioned this earlier. So as you know, Mr. Chair, historically, at least the last several capital cycles, we used to, anything that was $50,000 or under, rather than borrow for it, the capital, it's been paid, subject to town meeting, either, paid from capital stabilization, and that's replenished, and or free cash. That is not codified in the policy. Is that something you think that we should or just hold off on that? I mean, it's only worked well because of the status of the reserves and the free cash. It's something to think about.
Well, I think it's definitely something we should look at, whether it's not kind of leaving things as they are, but then maybe when we're going through the capital process with the rest of the capital committee, having, like, I guess I'll just say that we kind of just lump those lower levels into coming from the general fund, but not specifically where in the general fund, whether it's a borrow or straight out of stabilization.
Right.
So that would have to be, either codify in the policies by some kind of a differentiator where it's a dollar amount, or capital we have to change our process on the capital planning committee side where we're actually making that specific recommendation and phrasing it exactly as it's going to hit when it gets to town meeting.
Yeah. And you run the risk. I mean, again, it's worked because we have that flexibility. If you put it in the policy and then you don't have that flexibility, but
yeah,
an area to just think about.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on capital before we move on? No. Okay. So the next item is final review of the draft, which unfortunately we can't do because we have to revisit capital. But maybe we can talk through the next steps of completion after we get capital sorted.
Sure. So, Mr. Chair, so on this, and again, when we get back up and running, we're almost there as far as the review and the update at this point. The remaining areas, we've got it down to just a couple. One, as you just mentioned, is the capital piece, which was for today.
Yep.
The second one, and Barbara can maybe speak to this, she had the language we had been talking about the cannabis money, about having some language for the cannabis piece. Did you want to, through the chair, touch on that, Barbara?
Yep, through you, Scott.
Yeah, please.
I did verify with the Department of Revenue that similar to meals and sales tax, this tax is also general fund money. So as a housekeeping item, I was just going to put basically the same wording that we have in the sales and meals tax they recommended.
Okay.
And then at this point, if we want to maybe in a future year decide to allocate that money to something, we can save that for maybe next year when we have, I feel like the cannabis money is still kind of leveling out as the market saturates. So before we allocate it to something, I guess I'd like to have a couple more years of history of what that's going to bring in annually.
All right. No, that's a good recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, thank you, Barbara. So the chair, we would have, for next time, we will have the capital piece.
Yep.
We've got the cannabis piece that Barbara just explained, but we had it written. Those were the two areas. There's already in the document, which was the proposal on the UDAG policy. We've done all of the cleanup. So we're just about almost there. I think technology cooperating for the the buy board meeting, we could review which we had planned to do today, review the capital materials and the language on cannabis. And then what I would propose is because this is just an advisory group, consider, making a recommendation to send that draft, I think, to obviously the select board and the FinCom and all of the departments for review and input. And if Barbara would be willing to serve as the central point of contact as she did before for any input, we put a timeline on it. Then we get all of that information, so the review, and then it will have to go to the select board and the finance committee for, final approval.
Okay. Okay. So if we need to revisit the capital and then review the policies once things are up and running, do we want to schedule our next meeting out? And I know this is later on the agenda, like 4 weeks, or do we want to try and meet before then so we can push this along?
We could do before then if we hadn't had this technological issue. So we could, 2 or 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever's on the availability to keep this moving.
Okay. Yep. Pauline, you have a question? Is Pauline able to unmute?
I
There you
forget
go.
that part, sorry.
No, that's okay.
I came in late, and from what I heard at the beginning, I gather there's been something of an outage over at Town Hall, which might explain why Robert didn't get my email the other day. So I had several questions about the capital planning policy, but I will hold off on all of that until you reconvene. The other question was, would it be appropriate for me to make my suggestions in writing to you, Barbara, and Scott, so that in the event I can't make it, you at least can address them?
Sure. So through the chair, just Pauline, the network server had an issue, so we can't access anything until Thursday morning. Hence, and I did get your email, but I can't access any of the info. So yes, and if you would be happy to send that, that would be helpful.
All right, thank you. I will do that rather than try to monopolize your time today. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, Pauline.
I'm sorry, could I just, I missed it earlier. So the email server is down in town and you can't?
Through the chair, Dennis, in a nutshell, there was an issue. The network server has failed and everything is backed up. That's the good news. The bad news is it's going to take till tomorrow night to get everything back online. So right now, Town Hall has limited access to email and some basic internet, but we can't access any of the data files. So like, for example, the presentation slides we had we can't access them. We will have access according to IT by Thursday morning is the plan.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions or comments on just the policies in general? No? Okay, excellent. Thank you. So next item on the agenda is any new business. There's nothing listed, but I'll open up for anything from by board members to bring up. There's a lot of excitement on that one, so I guess we're good on that. And then finally, next item is scheduling of the next meeting. So if we go 2 weeks, it's the 14th. That does work for me. It works for other people.
It's fine for me.
And
That's-
celebrate the town's birthday by talking financial policies.
There we go.
At 2:00.
Okay.
That's also Valentine's Day, by the way.
It
It
is.
is. We're a very romantic town.
There'll be all kinds of love being spread,
Yes.
if not money.
Definitely money. All right, so that's all we have on the agenda. I'll open up for any last questions or comments before we adjourn. No? Okay, excellent. So with that, I will take a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn at 2:32, January 31st.
I'll second.
Roll call the vote, Ms. Tierney,
I
Ms. Antonellis,
Aye.
Mr. Freskowski,
Aye.
Mr. Pompriand,
Aye.
and the chair says aye. So we are adjourned.